Well, good afternoon. Perhaps we should make a start. I'm sorry for this week that I haven't produced a typed version of the lecture because I've been rather unwell, and the residue of my unwellness seems to have lodged in my throat this morning, so I'm hoping that water will stop me croaking too much. To recapitulate very, very briefly about where I think we are, the aim of the whole course over the 3 years is to look at the role of religion in general and Christianity in particular in a liberal society. And this year we're looking at the relationship between religious values and a market economy, which is an essential part of a liberal society. And in the first week I talked about some of the moral issues to do with markets, some to do with what are the moral underpinnings of markets, some to do with the moral boundaries of markets, and some issues to do with the moral consequences of markets. Because clearly people from faith standpoints can contribute towards a debate about morality from a faith point of view, but they can't really contribute to a technical issue in economics or whatever. And the aim has been, therefore, to try to identify a whole series of moral issues that churches, for example, could reasonably have a contribution to make towards shedding some light on these moral issues. And the second lecture was about freedom and markets, and sought to undermine the idea that freedom was just the absence of coercion, and that in the view I was arguing for, freedom does have to make some assessment of human flourishing and human purposes and so forth. It's not just a criterionless choice between alternatives, that freedom does, the idea of freedom does commit us to some idea of what are the significant choices in human life that might be made, and so forth, and also that it's impossible to understand the idea of coercion without having a clear idea of the values that are threatened by a coercive act. So that was the second lecture. The third lecture was about justice. The churches, particularly the Roman Catholic Church, have made the idea of social justice central to their teaching about social and economic life. And yet there's a whole strand of liberal economic thought which regards the idea of social justice as a complete illusion. And I tried to explain why those who take that view do in fact take that view, and also to try to undermine some of the assumptions that they make in holding the view that social justice is, in Friedrich von Hayek's words, a mirage. And today what I want to do is to look at something that's also pretty central to the debate about the nature of markets and the nature of belief. If you got into a conversation with someone about liberalism, it wouldn't be very long before there was a discussion of individualism. Individualism is a kind of element of the liberal case about markets, and part of individualism has to do with the sort of control and so forth that you can exercise over your own body. And are there any limits to that, and how are we to understand the relationship between self, body, and the community in which we're situated, which is a market kind of society? So what I want us to do today is to try to concentrate on some issues to do with the body and the idea of my controlling my body. And the core idea is this, and it's an idea that's particularly talked about in the United States, and you may regard it as a bit extreme, but it is quite salutary to look at extreme cases to try to figure out what's wrong with them and how insights into one or other sort of set of moral issues might be modified or whatever by looking at an extreme kind of case. Now, the idea that I'm taking as central to individualism is the idea that's come to be called, particularly in the United States, self-ownership. That if I own anything, I own myself, in the sense that I own my body, I own my body parts, I own my bodily secretions, and so on and so forth. That if I own anything, I must be regarded as owning my own body. And by owning my own body, we mean have unlimited control over one's own body, so that it's not legitimate for other people to interfere with my body without my express consent. And interference might mean assaulting me or something like that, which is a fairly obvious kind of interference, but equally it can be interference of a legislative sort, for example, prohibiting something like the sale of organs, or prohibiting euthanasia if that's what I want to engage in, and so on. That the idea of the control of one's body and individualism pretty central to the idea of a liberal market order, particularly, as I say, as it's understood in the United States and in economic and philosophical writings. And it's this idea of self-ownership that I want us to explore for a bit this morning. And as I said a minute ago, the core idea here is that the sort of control that I have means that you have a strict duty not to interfere with my body, either physically or legislatively, if you like to put it that way, except where there is a strong reason to do so. And the strong reason, the only strong reason that is legitimate, is that you can reasonably interfere with my use of my body when my use of my body interferes with you, where my right to control my own body is absolute, except in circumstances in which my exercising that control harms your similar right to control your body. And any attempt other than that to exercise control over someone else's body means imposing your values on this other person. So the obvious example to take, which I won't dwell on for the moment, but we'll come back to, is that of euthanasia. That if I control my body, and if things can only be done against me with my consent, if I control my body, then I ought to have control about how my body should die, or how I should die, to be a bit more idiomatic. And that your preventing that through legislation is an illegitimate imposition on me of your preferences. Now, the core idea behind this is that on a liberal individualist model, values are subjective. Values are a matter of subjective preference. I choose my own values and I live my life according to my own values. You, however, have your values, and if you want to prevent me from doing something like engaging in an act of euthanasia, in my own suicide, effectively, if you want to prevent that, then all you're doing is imposing your subjective values on me, and this is illegitimate. There are no values which transcend choice. There are no objective values that can be used to constrain my own use of my body and my own decisions about the future of my body. So crucial to the argument here is that values are of a subjective sort, and we can't invoke other people's values as a reason for preventing my doing what I want to do with my own body. And quite a useful distinction that's employed here, which was first proposed many years ago now by Professor Ronald Dworkin, who sadly died last week, a legal philosopher, was that we can distinguish between personal preferences and what you might call personal or internal preferences and external preferences. That I might have a very clear idea for myself about what my values are, about what my preferences are, how I want to live my life, and so on. You might have exactly the same, be in exactly the same position. You have preferences how you want to live your life. But in addition, you have preferences about how you think I should live my life as well. And these are external preferences. External preferences are about trying to impose on other people your own values as opposed to someone who has only internal or personal preferences. And it's illegitimate to try to impose external preferences on other people, and it's illegitimate for two reasons. First of all, if values are subjective, then your values do not count as being superior to mine. We just have conflicting and different values, and I should be able to live by the values that I think are important to me. And you should live by the values that are important to you, but that doesn't mean you can impose them on me. And the second reason why this is so is that, in a sense, the person who seeks perhaps successfully to impose his values on others through legislation, let's say, the person who does that is being counted as being more than one person, in a sense, because I only have preferences about how I should live my life. You have these double preferences about how you should live your life and how I should live my life as well. Now, why should your preferences be counted twice and mine only once? Because in your case, the state is counting your personal preference and your external preference. In my case, it's only counting my personal preference because I don't have any external preferences about how you should live your life. So the argument here is that that would be a fundamental civic inequality to count people's preferences about how other people should live their lives. This is pretty central to the liberal position, and it's part of what we mean by liberal individualism, that other people should not seek to impose their preferences on you. And the kind of fundamental reason here is that in imposing my values on you, I'm just imposing my subjective choices, and that is an illegitimate thing to do. So it depends partly upon the idea of justifying the idea that values are of a subjective sort. And if they are subjective, then there is no strong argument in favour of trying to impose your own values on other people. But what are the potential consequences of any such view, that we should not impose our values on other people? Well, that would give the space for this idea of personal control or self-ownership, that I should be free, both in my mind and in my body, to think and do what I like, so long as in doing so I don't prevent you from doing what you like. And that's what's meant by self-ownership or self-control in this kind of context. And it's worthwhile just looking at two or three of the implications of this idea, because they're quite complex and also quite startling in some respects if you take the idea of personal control or self-ownership really seriously. And the first one has to do with taxation. And this is an argument propounded by a famous American thinker called Robert Nozick in a book published in the early 1970s called Anarchy, State and Utopia. And in that book, Nozick argues that if my body cannot be controlled legitimately by another person or group of persons without my consent, then what about my labour? Because my labour is my physical labour. It is the movement of my body. Whatever I'm doing, whether I'm a surgeon operating on your brain or whether I'm a lumberjack cutting down a tree, labour is a set of physical movements. And I don't mean by that you couldn't have someone who laboured by doing mental arithmetic or something like that, only that a good deal of labour is purely physical, or it necessarily involves physical movements. Now, if labour involves physical movements and I am in control of my body, then I am in control of the physical movements that constitute my labour. But from that, we have a problem, according to Nozick. We have the problem of taxation. Because if the state taxes your labour at 30, 40, 50%, whatever it might be, then for part of the time that you are exercising your right to use your body as you like, the state is in fact taking the product of that labour and the fact that you've laboured as a basis for interfering in your life. So this is what Nozick says, and it's a pretty sort of trenchant view. If people force you to do certain work or unrewarded work for a certain period of time, they decide what you are to do and what purposes your work is to serve apart from your own decisions. This process whereby they take this decision from you makes them a part owner of you, just as having such potential control and power of decision by right over an animal or an inanimate object would be to have a property right in it. So what Nozick, and indeed many libertarians in the United States, argue is that taxation, in fact, gives the state property rights in other people's labour and in their bodies, and that this is wholly illegitimate unless you consented in each case to that. But the problem is that you can't leave taxation to be a matter of individual consent, because at least part of taxation is to finance what are called public goods, what economists call public goods. That is to say, goods that we all want, but which won't be provided by the market. And they won't be provided by the market because they require cooperative production, and yet you can't exclude those who don't contribute to the productive process. So something like clean air would be, or defence would be, a public good. It has to be produced cooperatively. You can't produce your own defence system. You can't produce clean air just for yourself. It has to involve others. But you can't exclude people who don't contribute to the creation of that public good. There are public types of goods that you can exclude non-contributors from. I mean, if you have a public park, you could put a fence round it and charge admission for going in, and unless you subscribe to the park, you're not eligible to go in, that kind of thing. But of course, defence and clean air, things like that, lighthouses, to use another classic example, are public goods in this sense that they require cooperative production, and their production is not excludable. Now, because of that, you can't leave taxation, even just for public goods, as a matter of choice. That you've got to, for the production of goods that we all want of this sort, you have to act coercively. That is to say, you all have to pay the tax to produce the outcome, because if you don't pay the tax, you can't be excluded from the good that's produced. So, on this view then, there is that you can't make taxation a purely a matter of individual choice. It's not a voluntary thing. It has to be something that is imposed on people. But that imposition, in Nozick's view, is just the state taking control of you, and meaning by that you sorry, I must just have a glass of water. Meaning by that you are partly owned by the state. Now, most people think this argument is absurd, but it's actually quite difficult to produce good reasons for thinking that it's absurd. Because what Nozick's position is that if somebody else, if you can only work in this society, if you can only exercise your bodily functions in labour in this society by paying a tax rate of some sort, then this is control over your body. And that control over your body is the equivalent of forced labour. You're being forced to do something which you don't directly benefit from and haven't yourself directly chosen. So quite a big issue there about how we are to understand the body, labour, taxation and the rights of the states. As I say, not many people are convinced about this, but nevertheless it's quite difficult to formulate a subtle argument to explain what's wrong with it. But the second thing I wanted to sort of focus on in relation to the body is that of property rights in the body. A market is an exchange of property rights. I own something, I sell it to you, you acquire that thing, and I acquire your money. It's an exchange of property rights. So it's pretty important to have some kind of understanding of the legitimacy of property. What is legitimate about the ownership of property? What is it that makes it morally important? Well, again, we have to look at the issue of the body, because individual exchanges are only legitimate if what we are exchanging we rightfully own. And we ultimately, acts of free exchange depend upon the justice of our acquisition of the property in the first place. I can only exchange something that is my property if I acquired it legitimately in the first place. So we have to focus on justice in acquisition, or the legitimacy of acquisition. And this is where the body comes in. And again, it's an argument from Nozick, and again, quite a difficult argument to refute. And it's this. Well, sorry, let me just take one step back there. If you look at what the churches have said about property over the years, and people like Aquinas and so forth in the Catholic tradition have said quite a lot about it, as did a famous, not very well known now, but a famous English theologian called Hastings Rashdall, who was the Dean of Carlisle, wrote a big book about Christianity and property rights. But one of the themes of Christian thinking about property has been that property comes with duties attached to it, that there are properties sort of morally all right, so long as we recognise that there are a range of duties attached to it. I mean, we in a sense should see what we own as a matter of stewardship or trust, that we own things on trust. We don't have an absolutely unlimited property right, that property must serve some kind of social purpose that is itself a legitimate kind of good. And a fairly modern, relatively modern view of that sort would be R.H. Tawney's arguments about property in his various books in the early part of the 20th century, that property isn't just an individual right, it's something that's enmeshed in a whole range of obligations. Now, Nozick and people who think like him reject this kind of idea. I can only have obligations because values are subjective. I can only have obligations which I freely choose to enter into, that the institution of property doesn't, as and of itself, as it were, create obligations. I can only have those obligations that I freely choose as a personal preference. Now, if you take that kind of view, does it mean that you have an absolutely unlimited right to acquire anything you like in any amount that you like? Well, the answer here for the libertarian position is not really. Perhaps that would be the best way of putting it. Take the following analogy. I go down to the beach with my son, and I have a bucket and spade with me, just a toy bucket. I don't mean, industrial type buckets. And this is a huge beach, and no one is going to be disadvantaged by my son filling his bucket up and taking a bucket of sand home with him to play with. And that is a kind of, my acquisition of that property, my acquisition of that bucket of sand isn't disadvantaging anybody at all because there is a more or less unlimited supply of it. So I do have a right to own property and to acquire property when that ownership does not diminish the opportunity for another person equally to acquire property. Now, but most cases aren't like that. Most cases do involve acquiring property and in so doing denying somebody else the opportunity or the reality of having that same property. Well, in the 17th century, the English philosopher John Locke, who also wrote a lot about religion and was a strong advocate of the idea of natural law, argued that in terms of property acquisition, a natural law being a kind of religious view of the law, Locke argued that in acquiring property, in coming to own something that is currently unowned, I can only legitimately acquire it as property for me if I leave what he called as much and as good for others, that I have to be concerned with the effect of my property acquisition on other people. And essentially what it means is I cannot lower the living standard, if you like, of someone else by my coming to own this property. I must leave as much and as good for others. However, in the defence of the modern liberal market and its reliance, as I said, on the idea of property, given that a market is an exchange of property, this argument has come to mean the following. I have a right to acquire property and to exchange property subject to the overall system of production and exchange being in the interests of the worst of people, who were those who would be made worse off by not having as much and as good, that if the system benefits them better than any other alternative, then my acquisition or my exercise of my property rights in that economy is legitimate. There is, therefore, a kind of constraint on property, but it is that the market itself improves the situation of the poor better than any other alternative. Now, as I said in one of the earlier lectures, I think last time, we have to be very careful about this, because it's one thing to say the market improves the absolute position of the poor, namely, am I better off this year than I was last year on my own terms? Or does it improve the relative position of the poor? That is to say, does it diminish inequality between the poor person and the richer person? Now, I'm sure that Nozick means the former, that the market improves the absolute position of the poor, and therefore, insofar as the market does that, the exercise of property rights in a market is entirely legitimate, because the overall system, through the trickle-down effect, as it's called, which I talked about last time, the overall system improves the position of the poor in absolute terms. It may actually make their position worse in relative terms, that is to say, it increases inequality. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that it improves their absolute position. So on this view, property, the acquisition and exchange of property, is perfectly morally legitimate, because the outcome of all of that in a market is to improve the absolute position of the worst off. It's not intended to do that, but it does that. And insofar as it does that, then property ownership is entirely fair and legitimate. And this is the only, well, it's hardly an obligation, but this is the only obligation that attaches to property, namely that I participate in a market that is free and fair, and that in being free, it improves the absolute position of the worst off. So there would be no justification, say, for a faith group to criticise the market order because it involves inequalities of property, or because property is somehow immoral, or whatever it might be, so long as the overall effect of the market is to improve the absolute position of the worst off members of society. And if it does that, then property is fair and legitimate. And any attempt to impose other obligations on property, that you should only have so much or whatever, would be this part of this business of other people imposing their subjective values on you, and that this is illegitimate because it involves double counting, as I explained earlier, and also there is no ground for imposing your preferences on me. So that we can forget about the kind of moral critique of capitalist ownership, so long as the position of the worst off in absolute terms is improving. That's the only moral constraint on property ownership. Now, the third thing I want to look at is the idea of self-ownership in relation to the buying and selling of the bodily parts, if you like. The sale of bodily parts and anything to do with the body, whether it's blood or whatever, is illegal in Britain under the various human tissue acts from over the years. And it's illegal to buy and sell organs or blood and so on. Now, for a strong liberal individualist, this is utterly illegitimate. Because if I own anything, I own my body. And if I own my body, I should be the person who determines what I want to do with it. And if I want to turn it, or parts of it, into a kind of commodity, to buy and sell, like my blood, for example, then I should be free to do so. And to have laws that prevent that, as we have here, is an illegitimate restraint on trade. There's a rather famous amongst economists, not that I am an economist, but there's a rather famous article by a man called, I'm sorry, his name's gone out of my head just as I was about to say it. But anyway, it's an article called The Production and Exchange of Used Body Parts. And it's in a Festschrift for a liberal economic thinker called Ludwig von Mises. The title of that essay tells you all you need to know, really, the production and exchange of used body parts. That if I own anything, I own my body, I should be able to use what is undoubtedly my property in the way that I want. Now, you may regard that as being immoral or whatever, but that's just your preference. And there is no reason why you should seek to impose your preferences on me. And this is an interesting argument to try to sort of probe a bit further, because there is a certain amount of empirical evidence that's also relevant to it, and it's not just about moral argument. There was a famous book published in the 1970s by Professor Richard Titmuss, called The Gift Relationship, which was about the blood donor system. Now, as I say, it is illegal to buy and sell blood in the United Kingdom. And the blood donor system is, of course, a voluntary, it's a donor system. You don't need me to spell it out. It's a voluntary system. It also produces enough blood to meet needs, and it does so in an efficient way. And this is quite a remarkable thing in a sense, because many economists would be pretty well, their default position would be something like a donor system can't really be efficient. So why is it efficient compared with a system in which blood is bought and sold, as the liberal individualists might want it to be? Well, remember when Titmuss was writing, Titmuss's argument is that it's efficient partly because people voluntarily give their blood in the quantities that are needed, but also because individuals who are giving their blood do it on an altruistic basis. Therefore, you can, in a sense, trust their donation. And you don't need to conduct extensive tests on the quality of the blood that is donated, because it's an altruistic act, and therefore, why would someone try to provide contaminated blood as part of an altruistic act, whether it's contaminated by drugs or whether it's contaminated by things like hepatitis C and so on and so forth. Now, in the alternative system where blood is bought and sold, Titmuss argued, this wouldn't be so, because if you were buying and selling blood, particularly if you were selling it, you would have quite a strong incentive to disguise any kind of contamination in your blood, because you want the money. You're doing it for the money. You're not doing it as an altruistic act. So in Titmuss's view, in the United States, where this system works, the costs of testing blood are far higher than they are in the United Kingdom, because you can't trust the donation. And this made the voluntary gift of blood on a national basis a more efficient system than a market, if you like. And furthermore, a market, so the liberal individualist then might shift his ground and say, okay, Professor Titmuss, I accept that you're right about that, but you shouldn't preclude the idea of having a market for those who want to buy and sell their blood. Well, Titmuss' argument was this, which I think is a much weaker argument, but his argument was this, that if you brought in a market alongside a donor system, then people would be less inclined to give blood, even though they might also be not inclined at all to sell blood, because they would take the view that the state, in organising this kind of dual source of supply, had downgraded the quality, I don't mean quality really, had downgraded the value of the gift, that they'd say, well, it's just like an economic exchange, you can either sell it or you can give it, and that this is to downgrade the value of altruism in society because you're providing an alternative for which there is a payment. And his conjecture, which of course nobody knows the answer to, is that a lot of people who currently give blood would stop giving it, but equally they wouldn't sell it. Now, we don't know the answer to that. But the interesting point is that in the Titmuss case, it's quite difficult to know how far the argument about efficiency still works, because with the advent of HIV, the question of testing blood that is given in donation seems to have that because of HIV and the need to test it for HIV, you now have a system where all blood is tested pretty rigorously, and that donated blood doesn't now have the competitive advantage, as it were, that it had over sold blood in the earlier system, where you could trust the donation because you wouldn't give on the basis that the blood was contaminated. It would be a very strange act of altruism to do that. So, from the point of view of the liberal individualist, if the voluntary market isn't as efficient as, or doesn't have the advantages of efficiency that Titmuss claimed for it now because of HIV, then there is absolutely no reason not to have a market in blood and blood products. And equally, there is no reason not to have a market in organs, particularly given the shortfall of organs like kidneys and so forth. And they can be donations by living donors, as in the case of kidneys and so on, or a market in the organs of dead people, and the beneficiaries of their estate would benefit from the sale of these organs. So on this view, there is absolutely no reason why we shouldn't turn our own bodies into a kind of source of commodities, if you like, and to treat our organs and our things like blood as property that can be traded in a market. Now, I want to come on to the issue of what a commodity is and the whole thrust of what's sometimes called commodification in a later lecture, but let's just concentrate on this particular issue for the moment without getting too hooked up on whether we should think of the body and its parts as a commodity or not. So what are and I've remembered the name of the economist now, suddenly, Simon Rottenberg produced this essay, The Production Exchange of Used Bodily Parts. What are the arguments against a market in bodily parts? I mean, this is why I said earlier, the argument of the liberal individualists, although quite extreme, are interesting because it tests out a lot of your ordinary assumptions and intuitions. What are the strong arguments against having a market in bodily parts? After all, it's an exercise in choice, it's an exercise in autonomy. The fact that you find it distasteful, it's got absolutely nothing to do with it, because you have your values, I have mine. There are no objective, transcendental values to impose on you, and so on. And the voluntary system is still there, if that's what you want to do. Nobody's preventing you giving blood, but I just want to sell mine, and to prevent me from selling it is an infringement of my rights, my right of ownership over my body. If I own my body, I should be able to order how its parts and so forth are exchanged, whether through gift or through exchange, through economic exchange. Now, I think there are 2 or 3 arguments here which we'll come back to a bit when we look at the issue of commodities. I think it's perhaps in the next lecture. First of all, and this is the weakest argument, I think, although it's perhaps the most popular, that ideas like the integrity of the body provide a basis, so it's argued, for not wanting to turn the body into a commodity, because we can't really distinguish between a person and their body. If you turn their body into a commodity, or parts of their body into a commodity, then in a sense you are you're commodifying the whole person. That this, in a sense, undermines the integrity of a human life. But the answer to that is fairly straightforward from the liberal individualistic point of view, namely, well, that's fine, that's your preference, don't you go and sell bits of your body then, but don't try and prevent me from selling bits of mine. That's your subjective preference, I've got my subjective preference. And we should have the alternative of doing one or the other. And if you want to persist with altruism and giving and voluntary giving and so forth, that's fine. I want to make some money out of my bodily parts, and you shouldn't impose your preference on me. Well, we've looked at that argument already. The second argument, and I say we will come back to these a bit, the second argument is derived from Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, lived at the end of the 18th century, died in the early 19th century, who did consider some rather primitive examples of selling your bodily parts. One was that he was rather horrified by the castrato singers in Italy, particularly those who were castrated to join, with their consent, the Sistine Chapel choir. And he felt that it was quite wrong for people to mutilate their bodies or have them mutilated in order to enhance a career and indeed income. One or two of these castrati were extremely wealthy men, because they were, well, you can imagine why, there weren't that many of them, and they were in great demand as singers. And Kant also thought about selling your hair, and he thought that was all right, because it's not, it's a part of your body that renews itself. He also talked about selling your teeth. In Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, I haven't seen the film, but there's a rather awful passage in which a young girl's teeth are extracted to make dentures for the better off. And what's wrong with selling your teeth? Well, for Kant, this becomes somewhere between the castrati and the hair, because your teeth won't grow again. But on the other hand, it's not as such a kind of imposition on your body as castrating somebody. Kant's argument here, having looked at these examples, was that the fundamental moral principle in Kant's view is that we should treat individuals as ends in themselves and not as means to other people's ends. And this is an argument that resonates a lot with the Christian moral point of view. And in Kant's view, if you're selling part of yourself, then you are treating yourself as a means to the ends of others, that you are not respecting the person that is yourself, as it were, and that in doing this, you are just treating yourself as an instrument to someone else's will. Well, so we'll come back to that later. And the final point, so I'm sorry I've gone on rather a long time today, but this is the final point, and it's a quick one. One argument that's put forward, there was a big case about this in about 1989, when the Humana Hospital in London was found to be buying kidneys from rather poverty-stricken peasants in Turkey to transplant into rich clients. And the argument there was, you shouldn't be doing this, even though it would transform the peasant's life to have a few £1,000s out of this. You shouldn't be doing this because it's actually exploitative of poor people, that you are that they don't really have a choice if you offer them a transformative amount of money. Well, the liberal individualists won't at all be impressed by this argument, because if you remember from the second lecture, those of you who are here, the liberal argument is that the possession of resources has absolutely nothing to do with freedom. Or to quote Sir Keith Joseph, as I did at the time in his book on equality, poverty is not unfreedom. The lack of resources is not a restriction on liberty. And therefore, the lack of resources is not the basis of a form of exploitation either. So in making this transformative offer to a poor person, we'll give you £5,000 for your kidney, that is not a form of exploitation. It's a perfectly legitimate form of freedom of exchange. So the challenge is, if you want to take it up, is to try to think of good reasons why I shouldn't regard myself as the sort of proprietor of my own body and seek to do with it whatever will make me better off if that's what I want to do. And it's quite tricky to think of reasons that are compelling to stop that view in its tracks on grounds other than, well, my preference is that you shouldn't do it, and my preference is going to win over you. So what we need to do, if we want to look at this from a faith-based point of view, is to try to figure out what are good reasons for not thinking of the body as a kind of an economic resource. It's easy to say, if you want to talk in terms of rights, as liberals often do, that we have a right to life. And many critics of liberalism will then say, but we also have a right to the means to life, right? But what if my means to life, to which I have a right, are part of your body, your blood or your kidney or whatever it might be? And you might think this is terribly fanciful, but it isn't. There was a case quite a few years ago now in Allegheny in the United States, McFall versus Shrimp, where Mr. McFall was dying of leukemia, and his cousin, Mr. Shrimp, was the only known potential bone marrow donor. Mr. Shrimp refused to donate bone marrow, and Mr. McFall took him to court to try to get the court to coerce him into giving bone marrow, because he thought his right to life involved a right to part of somebody else's body. And of course the court, not surprisingly, refused to do this, and Mr. McFall duly died. But there is this question of what are we to do when the right to life involves a right to part of some other person's body? Do you say, well, that's where it stops? Or would a market be better in those sorts of circumstances? Oh, sorry, I've gone on too long.